3 female convicts in the gamekeeper's cabin. At night, something no one expected happened. The sun was setting behind the dense forest, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. The trees whispered with the wind, their tall branches swaying gently, making the small forest path seem even narrower than it was. At the end of the path, a small wooden cabin appeared, weathered and worn by years of storms and cold winters. Its windows were dark, and a thin wisp of smoke curled lazily from the crooked chimney. The place looked lonely, almost forgotten by the world, but tonight it was meant to be a temporary home. 3 women walked toward the cabin, their footsteps crunching on the frozen earth. Each carried a small bag containing only the essentials, their movements careful and deliberate. The first, Mara, moved quietly, almost like she was trying not to be noticed by the forest itself. She had sharp eyes, always scanning the trees and listening to the sounds around her. There was a calmness in her face, but also a tension that hinted she was used to being cautious. Beside her, Lena walked with a confident stride. She spoke softly to herself, humming under her breath, as if the forest could not touch her boldness. Her hair was tied back tightly, and her bright eyes sparkled with energy, even in the cold. The third, Tess, followed close behind, her shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying more than just her bag. She glanced nervously at the shadows around her, biting her lip now and then. Unlike the others, she seemed smaller, fragile in some ways, but there was a cleverness in her eyes that suggested she noticed everything, even the things others did not. The women were not ordinary travelers. Each had spent time behind bars and had recently been released for a work program that required them to live temporarily in isolated areas. This cabin, far from towns or neighbors, was assigned for tonight's stay. They had no choice but to obey the rules of the program. Their minds were not only on the cold night, but also on the uncertainty that lay ahead. None of them knew exactly what awaited inside, and the forest made it impossible to relax. As they approached the cabin, a sudden gust of wind rattled the wooden door. The sound echoed through the silent trees and made Tess jump. Lena stopped and turned toward her, a grin on her face, as if to say, "It's just the wind." Mara, however, frowned slightly, her instincts telling her that something about this place was different. The cabin was small, barely able to fit a table and 3 beds comfortably, but it was the only shelter nearby. They had no other options. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. The fireplace sat cold and empty, its blackened interior a reminder that someone had used it long ago. The furniture was minimal, a small table, 3 wooden chairs, and 3 narrow beds lined along one wall. A single lantern hung from a hook near the center of the room. It was old but functional, and with a few matches, it could provide light to keep the dark at bay. Mara set her bag down carefully, inspecting the room before touching anything else. Lena immediately began to explore, opening drawers and tapping on the walls, her energy filling the otherwise silent space. Tess stayed near the doorway, hesitating before stepping fully inside. They had been warned about the isolation. The nearest road was miles away, and help could take hours to reach if anything went wrong. Mara began to unpack some of the items they were allowed to bring, a few blankets, canned food, and water. She placed them neatly on the table, trying to create a sense of order. Lena, on the other hand, kept moving around, touching the windows and examining the locks. She spoke to the empty room as if expecting it to respond. "Not much of a place for comfort, is it?" Her words made Tess smile faintly, even as the shadows seemed to stretch longer in the corners. As night fell, the forest outside became darker, almost as if the trees were closing in. The wind blew harder, causing the cabin to creak and moan. Mara lit the lantern, casting a soft, warm glow across the room. The flickering light made shadows dance on the walls, creating shapes that seemed alive. Lena chuckled nervously. "Feels like the forest is watching us." Tess did not respond. She only watched the shadows, imagining every possible noise that might come from the trees outside. The women tried to make themselves comfortable. Mara suggested they sit together by the fire, even though it had yet to be lit, for the warmth and comfort of company. Lena began gathering some dry wood she found near the cabin's porch, ready to start a fire. Tess sat on one of the beds, holding her knees, her eyes still scanning the window, listening for every sound. The cold outside made their breaths visible, small clouds that quickly disappeared into the air. As they settled in, they began talking quietly, sharing small details about their lives. Mara spoke first, not much about herself, just enough to let the others know she had learned from her past mistakes. Lena talked about her experiences in a way that was fiery and unapologetic. She admitted her faults but refused to be ashamed of them. Tess spoke less, choosing her words carefully, revealing a quiet intelligence and thoughtfulness that the others began to notice. Even though they came from different worlds and backgrounds, there was a sense of understanding forming between them, a bond born out of circumstance and necessity. The cabin seemed to respond to their presence. Every creak and groan of the wooden walls made them jump at first, but gradually they learned to listen without fear. Outside, the wind howled like a lonely voice in the night, brushing against the trees and shaking the cabin's roof. Occasionally, a branch would tap against a window, startling Tess so much she would squeeze her eyes shut. Lena, however, laughed softly. "It's just nature, nothing more." Mara only nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly, always alert, always thinking. Time passed slowly. The night seemed longer than usual, the kind of darkness that makes every small sound feel enormous. The women ate a simple meal of canned food warmed over the small fire they had managed to light. They spoke little, the cold and isolation making conversation difficult. Yet even in silence, there was an unspoken connection forming. They were three strangers bound by circumstance, each facing the unknown together. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds. The distant howl of an animal, the rustling of branches, the soft, eerie whistle of the wind. Inside, the cabin was small, yet it felt like a safe bubble amidst the vast wilderness. Mara kept glancing at the door, half expecting someone or something to appear. Lena seemed unafraid, but even she could not ignore the strange tension that filled the room. Tess shivered slightly, imagining shadows moving beyond the windows. Hours passed. The moon rose, casting a pale light through the cabin's small windows. Shadows moved across the walls as the fire flickered. Each woman lay down on her narrow bed, still alert despite exhaustion. Mara stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind. Lena stared at the fire, thinking about the day and what tomorrow might bring. Tess held a small blanket close, her mind spinning with thoughts and fears. The night was far from ordinary. It was long, silent, and full of small, almost imperceptible moments that made the forest seem alive. The women were aware of the isolation, of how alone they truly were in that frozen place. Yet, as the hours passed, a quiet understanding began to grow between them. They did not know each other well, but in the stillness of the night, they began to trust, to rely on one another in small ways. Mara shared a blanket with Tess when she shivered. Lena fetched more firewood without being asked. Tess helped Mara arrange some of the supplies more neatly. By the time the night reached its deepest hour, the cabin felt less like a trap and more like a refuge. The three women, each with their own fears and regrets, began to accept the reality of the night. They were not completely at ease, not yet, but they were together, facing the unknown side by side. Outside, the forest still whispered and moaned, but inside, the warmth of the fire and the presence of each other provided a fragile comfort. And so, the first night in the Gamekeeper's cabin began, a night that promised more than just cold and silence. It promised uncertainty, and perhaps a chance for the three women to discover something about themselves and each other that no one could have expected. The shadows on the walls flickered, the wind howled, and the snow fell silently outside as the women lay awake, ready for whatever the night might bring. The night grew deeper, and the cold outside seemed to press against the walls of the cabin. The wind blew harder now, rattling the thin window panes and causing the shadows from the fire to stretch and twist in strange shapes across the wooden floor. Mara, Lena, and Tess had tried to settle down, but none of them could sleep. Each sound from outside, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, even the distant howl of an animal, made them start and glance at each other. Mara, sitting near the fire, kept her eyes on the doorway. Her mind was alert, trained by years of careful thinking and observation. She noticed things the others did not. The way the wind moved the curtains, the pattern of the snow drifting against the cabin's walls, the way the shadows shifted with every flicker of the flame. She did not speak, but her presence alone seemed to command attention. Lena, however, could not stay still. She walked slowly around the cabin, examining the furniture and tapping on the walls. Her boldness was a mask, but the forest seemed to unsettle her more than she wanted to admit. "It's just the wind," she said softly, almost to convince herself. "There's nothing out there that can hurt us." But even as she said it, she jumped when a loose board creaked under her foot. Tess remained near the window, clutching her small blanket tightly. She stared out into the darkness, her mind running through countless possibilities. Every movement in the shadows became a story in her head. Was it a small animal, or something larger? Could someone be watching? She wanted to believe it was only the wind, but the forest had a way of making imagination feel real. The women tried to distract themselves. Mara suggested they eat a little more of their food. They gathered around the small table, the warm glow of the lantern making the canned food look more inviting than it really was. They ate slowly, talking in low voices. Lena tried to lighten the mood with stories from her past, things she had done while serving her sentence. Her stories were filled with energy and mischief, and for a moment, Tess and Mara could smile despite the unease that filled the room. But the forest outside would not allow them peace for long. A sudden gust of wind slammed against the cabin door, making it shake violently. Tess gasped and clutched the edge of the table. Lena grabbed a chair, placing it against the door almost instinctively. Mara stood calmly, her eyes narrowing as she listened. There was more than just wind out there. The sound was heavier, deliberate in some way, as if something or someone was moving near the cabin. The women exchanged worried glances. Lena tried to appear brave. "It's just the old cabin settling," she said, though her voice was a little higher than usual. Tess did not respond. Mara, ever observant, shook her head slightly. "Something is outside. I can hear it moving, not just the wind," she said quietly. They decided to stay together in the center of the cabin, near the fire and the lantern. Lena brought over some extra blankets, wrapping herself and Tess in one while Mara stayed slightly apart, her eyes still scanning the doorway and windows. The warmth helped, but it could not chase away the tension. Every sound from outside seemed louder, more threatening. Hours passed slowly. The forest's noises were constant. The rustling of branches, the scratching of something moving in the underbrush, the occasional soft thump as snow fell from a branch onto the ground. The women could feel their anxiety growing, and it was clear that the isolation of the cabin was starting to weigh heavily on them. Mara spoke again, trying to calm the others. "It's likely an animal. We are in its territory, and it's scared just like we are. We need to stay calm." Her voice was steady, measured. Tess nodded quietly, though her fingers still trembled slightly as she held her blanket closer. Lena, after a moment of hesitation, let out a small laugh, trying to break the tension. "If it's an animal, maybe it's just curious. Maybe it wants to see what three ladies are doing in its forest." Despite their attempts to calm each other, the night brought more strange occurrences. The lantern flickered suddenly, casting long shadows that made the walls seem alive. The floorboards creaked under no visible weight. Tess, convinced she saw something move in the corner, clutched the blanket tighter and whispered, "I saw it over there." Lena looked, then shrugged. "It's probably a shadow. This fire plays tricks." Mara, however, moved quietly to the spot Tess indicated. There was nothing there, yet the feeling of being watched remained. The women huddled together, and Mara suggested they play a simple game to keep their minds occupied. They took turns telling small, personal stories, not about the past that got them in trouble, but moments of hope, kindness, or courage from their lives. Lena spoke of helping an elderly neighbor when she was younger. Tess described a quiet moment by a river that made her feel free for the first time. Mara shared a memory of her sister, someone she had missed dearly. The stories helped. The cabin felt warmer, and for a few minutes, the forest outside seemed a little less frightening. Suddenly, a loud thump shook the cabin. The women jumped, and Tess cried out softly. Lena grabbed the nearest chair again, placing it in front of the door. Mara stood and moved slowly to the corner of the room, listening. There it was again, a heavier sound moving deliberately around the cabin. It was not a branch, not snow falling from a tree. Someone or something was circling outside. Fear began to mix with their curiosity. "Should we look?" Tess whispered, her voice trembling. Lena shook her head. "Not yet. We need to be careful. If it's an animal, we don't want to scare it. If it's a person, we need to protect ourselves." Mara nodded, keeping her calm, but her mind raced through possibilities. She remembered everything she had been taught about observing without acting, about noticing details others missed. The night grew colder. Snow began falling lightly, tapping against the windows. The wind howled again, making the cabin walls creak and groan. The women stayed close together, listening intently. Then a scratching sound came from the window. Tess screamed softly and Lena jumped forward. Mara held up a hand, signaling them to stay calm. They watched as a small, furry face appeared at the window, a fox, perhaps lost or curious, its eyes wide and bright in the lantern light. Relief washed over them, though it was mixed with surprise. The fox seemed hesitant, unsure whether to enter or leave. Mara slowly approached it, speaking softly. "It won't hurt us," she said. The fox tilted its head, looking at her with cautious curiosity. Tess inched closer, fascinated despite her fear. Lena laughed softly, finally relaxing. "Well, that's unexpected," she said. For the next hour, the women observed the small creature. They brought out a tiny bit of food from their supplies, placing it near the fox. It hesitated, then took a small bite. They watched it, almost mesmerized, forgetting the cold and the isolation for a moment. This unexpected visitor, so fragile and vulnerable, reminded them of their own situation. Alone in the forest, far from help, each woman had her own fears and regrets, yet they also had the chance to make a difference, even in small ways. The night continued, but it felt less threatening now. The fox curled up near the fire, its presence strangely comforting. The women settled again on their beds, closer together than before. Mara kept watch, as always, but there was a sense of peace in the cabin that had not been there before. Lena and Tess whispered quietly, sharing thoughts and observations about the day and the night. They laughed softly, careful not to disturb the small animal. Time passed slowly, but it was no longer filled with fear alone. The night had shifted from tension to wonder. The forest outside was still dark and mysterious, but inside the cabin, the women had found a small spark of hope and connection. They were strangers still, but the events of the evening had brought them closer, teaching them to trust each other in ways words could not explain. As the night wore on, they finally began to drift into uneasy sleep, each comforted by the presence of the other and by the small creature they had cared for. The wind continued to whistle outside, and the snow continued to fall, but the cabin no longer felt like a trap. It was a place of safety, a place where fear could be faced and transformed into courage. And so, the night continued, long and cold but no longer lonely. The women, the fox, and the quiet warmth of the fire shared the cabin in silence, each aware that the forest could bring surprises, yet also small miracles, even in the darkest hours. The night was far from over, and the women knew that dawn would bring new challenges and perhaps more unexpected events. But for now, they rested, united by the strange and unexpected occurrences that had turned fear into wonder. The night seemed endless, but the fire in the small cabin still crackled softly, casting its golden glow across the walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the snow fell gently, muffling most of the usual forest noises. Mara, Lena, and Tess had settled down after the unexpected visitor. A small, timid fox had briefly eased their tension. But even as they tried to rest, none of them could shake the feeling that something more was about to happen. Mara sat quietly near the fire, her eyes alert and focused. She had learned that in the wilderness, one could not afford to relax completely. Every sound, every shadow could carry a message. Tonight, the cabin felt unusually still, almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Lena leaned back against the wall, wrapped in blankets, but her hands twitched as she listened intently. Tess, meanwhile, stayed near the fox, gently stroking its fur. The little creature had warmed to them, its wide eyes watching every movement in the room. Hours passed slowly. The fire burned low, sending small sparks up the chimney. The fox had finally curled into a tight ball near the hearth, its warmth comforting against the chill. Mara watched the shadows that danced across the walls, noticing small changes in the light. Lena yawned, trying to fight off the exhaustion that came from a night filled with unease. Tess whispered softly, almost to herself, "I wish morning would come. It feels like the night will never end." Then, without warning, a sound echoed from outside the cabin that was unlike anything they had heard before. It was a soft tapping, deliberate and measured, coming from the roof and the walls in quick succession. The three women froze instantly. Tess's grip on her blanket tightened and Lena jumped to her feet. Mara remained calm, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows near the window. The sound was not random, it was something or someone moving with purpose. Lena whispered, "What is that? It's too heavy to be a small animal." Tess peeked out the window, but the darkness made it impossible to see anything clearly. Mara motioned for them to stay quiet and listen. The tapping continued for several minutes, and then, unexpectedly, the back door creaked slightly. All three women exchanged nervous glances. Mara stepped toward the door, her hand resting lightly on the handle. She spoke in a soft, steady voice, "We need to see what it is. Stay behind me." Lena nodded, excitement and fear mixing in her eyes, while Tess clutched the blanket even tighter. Mara opened the door slowly, peeking out into the snow-covered backyard. The moonlight reflected off the snow, making everything appear silver and strange. At first there was nothing. Then a shadow moved near the edge of the forest. It was small, quick, and seemed almost afraid. The fox, sensing movement, stirred slightly but stayed near the fire. Mara noticed the shadow pause and looked directly toward the cabin, as if considering whether to approach or retreat. The women could not see clearly, but there was an unmistakable sense of life, a presence watching them from the darkness. Suddenly, the shadow darted forward toward the cabin, not with the stealth of a predator but with hesitation, almost like it was lost. Lena gasped. Tess covered her mouth in shock. Mara remained calm but acted quickly. "It's probably an animal," she said firmly, though her mind was open to other possibilities. "We just need to see it, make sure it's safe." Slowly, Mara stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath her boots. The wind was stronger now, pushing cold air against her face. The fox had followed her outside, keeping a cautious distance. The shadow moved closer, and the women could finally see that it was not dangerous at all. It was a young deer, a small fawn that must have become separated from its mother in the storm earlier that night. Its fur was dusted with snow, and its large brown eyes looked at them with fear and confusion. The three women breathed a quiet sigh of relief. Lena knelt down slowly, speaking softly to the animal. "It's okay. You're safe here." Tess joined her, her hands extended, trying not to startle the fawn. Mara stayed nearby, keeping watch over both the animal and the surrounding forest. The fawn hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether to trust them, but the warmth of the cabin and the gentle voices of the women seemed to calm it. For the next hour, they cared for the young deer. They cleared a small space near the fireplace and placed some blankets on the floor. Mara gently guided the fawn inside, while Lena and Tess made sure it was comfortable. The creature shivered at first but soon began to relax as it felt the warmth and safety of the cabin. It was a quiet, magical moment, three women and a young animal, together in the middle of a vast, cold forest, sharing a connection that needed no words. As they tended to the fawn, the women spoke softly to each other. Lena admitted, "I never expected tonight to be like this. I thought it would just be a long, scary night in the cabin." Tess nodded, smiling faintly. "Me too, but this feels different. Somehow it's not just fear anymore. It's hope." Mara, still watching the shadows outside, finally allowed herself a small smile. "Sometimes the unexpected can remind us of what matters. We were scared, but we didn't panic. We stayed together, and that made all the difference." The night continued to unfold with quiet wonder. The storm outside had not grown worse, but the snow covered the ground in a soft, sparkling blanket. The cabin, once dark and threatening, now felt alive with warmth and companionship. The fire flickered, reflecting in the fawn's wide eyes, and the fox curled near the hearth, both animals seeming to sense the safety of the cabin and the kindness of the women. Hours passed, but none of them wanted to sleep yet. The energy of the night, combined with the presence of the animals, made everything feel surreal. Lena and Tess took turns gently feeding the fawn some of the food they had brought, while Mara ensured the fire stayed bright and warm. They laughed softly when the fawn stumbled or tried to play with the blankets. Even in the coldest, darkest night, moments of joy had found their way into the cabin. Through it all, the women shared stories and memories. They spoke of moments when they had felt lost or alone, and how small acts of kindness, like the one they were performing now, had changed everything. Mara revealed a memory of helping an injured bird years ago, and Lena described comforting a frightened child in her neighborhood. Tess spoke of times she had cared for stray animals despite having little herself. Each story reflected the growth and change they had experienced since leaving prison, showing that kindness and courage could flourish even in the harshest conditions. As midnight passed and the first signs of dawn began to appear in the sky, the cabin was calm. The fawn had fallen asleep on the blankets, and the fox had curled even closer to the fire. The women finally sat down, exhausted but content. For the first time that night, they felt at peace, having faced their fears and discovered something unexpected, not danger, but life, trust, and connection. Mara looked at her companions and said softly, "Tonight, we learned that even in a place that seems frightening, there can be moments that change us. We stayed together. We cared for something weaker than ourselves. That is what matters." Lena nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's true. I feel different now, stronger, maybe even braver." Tess, still holding the small blanket she had wrapped around herself earlier, smiled quietly. "And not alone. We were afraid, but we faced it together. That's something I will remember." The first light of dawn slowly crept through the small windows of the cabin, casting a gentle glow on the walls. The snow outside glistened, untouched and pure, as if the forest itself had paused to watch the night's events. The women watched the light fill the cabin, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment and calm. They had survived the night, cared for a lost fawn, and shared an experience that would stay with them forever. The forest outside was quiet now. The storm passed, leaving only the soft whisper of the wind and the occasional call of a distant bird. Inside the cabin, the women felt a bond that went beyond words. The fear they had felt earlier was still present in their memories, but it had been replaced by a quiet pride and hope. They had faced the unknown and found something extraordinary in the process. And so the night came to an end, leaving the three women, the fawn, and the fox in a cabin that had once seemed frightening, but now felt alive with warmth and life. They had faced the darkness, confronted their fears, and discovered that even in the most unexpected circumstances, kindness, courage, and trust could shine through. The events of this night would stay with them forever, a reminder that life could surprise and transform, even in the coldest, darkest places. The first light of dawn slowly crept through the small windows of the cabin, painting the walls with a soft, golden glow. The snow outside shimmered under the early sunlight, sparkling like tiny diamonds scattered across the forest floor. Inside, the cabin felt warm and alive. The fire in the hearth still crackled gently, though its flames were low, casting a soft light on the three women and the two animals that had shared the night with them. Mara, Lena, and Tess stirred quietly, each feeling the gentle peace that comes after a long, tense night. Mara was the first to stand. She stretched carefully, mindful not to disturb the fawn, which was still curled up comfortably on the blankets near the fire. The fox, too, had settled down, its tail wrapped neatly around its body. Mara's eyes swept across the cabin, taking in the quiet scene. There was something magical about the moment. After a night full of fear and uncertainty, they had found calm. She could feel a sense of accomplishment deep in her chest, a quiet pride that came not from triumph over others, but from compassion and care. Lena rose next, brushing a strand of hair from her face and smiling faintly. She looked at the animals and then at her companions. "I can't believe what happened last night," she whispered. "It was unexpected, but somehow it felt right." Tess nodded silently, still clutching the small blanket she had wrapped around herself during the night. Her eyes were wide, reflecting a mixture of wonder and exhaustion. "It feels like we did something good," she said softly. "Even if it was small, it mattered." The three women moved carefully around the cabin, making sure not to disturb the fawn or the fox. Mara fetched some water in a small container and offered it to the animals. The fawn cautiously drank, while the fox sniffed and then drank a little as well. Lena and Tess watched quietly, their hearts warming at the sight. The animals, once strangers and frightened, had become part of their small cabin world. It was a quiet reminder that even in unexpected circumstances, life could be gentle and forgiving. After making sure the animals were comfortable, the women began tidying the cabin. Mara stacked the firewood neatly, preparing for the next cold night. Lena swept the small floor with a broom she found in the corner, brushing away snow that had drifted inside during the night. Tess carefully folded the blankets and tidied the supplies they had brought with them. Though the work was small and simple, it gave them a sense of purpose. They were creating order from the chaos of the previous night, and in doing so, they were also creating a small sanctuary in the middle of the forest. Once the cabin was tidied, the women sat down together near the fire, sipping warm water from small cups. Silence filled the room, but it was a comfortable silence, different from the tense quiet of the night. Each woman was lost in her thoughts, reflecting on what had happened and what it had meant to them. Mara thought about the instincts and patience that had helped them stay calm. Lena considered her own impulsiveness and how it had softened as she worked with the animals. Tess reflected on the courage it had taken to step forward and care for something weaker, despite her fears. After a few minutes, Lena spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "Do you realize how much changed for us last night? We came here scared, unsure of ourselves and the world, and now I feel like we're different. Somehow stronger." Tess nodded. "It's true," she said. "I still feel afraid of the forest and the unknown, but I know now that fear doesn't have to control me. We can face it together." Mara smiled gently. "Exactly. And the important thing is that we didn't face it alone. That's what made all the difference." The women spent some time observing the fawn, which had finally stood and was exploring the cabin cautiously. It nuzzled the blankets, sniffed the corners, and then moved toward the fire, its movements slow and careful. The fox watched from its curled position, its eyes following every motion. The three women laughed softly at the animal's cautious antics, feeling a lightness in their hearts that had been absent the night before. It was a small, simple joy, but in the middle of the forest it felt monumental. As the sun climbed higher, the forest outside came alive with sounds. Birds chirped in the trees, and the soft rustle of leaves signaled the start of a new day. The women opened the cabin door and stepped outside, feeling the cold morning air on their faces. Snow crunched beneath their boots, sparkling in the sunlight. For the first time, they could see the full beauty of their surroundings. A world that had seemed threatening in the dark of night was now peaceful and bright. The fawn followed them to the doorway, and the fox padded close behind. Mara knelt and held out her hands to the fawn, who approached cautiously. Lena and Tess watched, their expressions soft with wonder. It was a quiet moment, a connection between humans and animals, a reminder of trust and care that crossed the boundaries of species. The women realized that their fear had transformed into compassion, and that the simple act of kindness had created a bond stronger than fear itself. After spending a few moments outside, they returned to the cabin to gather their belongings. Mara packed carefully, while Lena and Tess folded blankets and tidied the remaining supplies. The fawn and the fox stayed near the cabin, not wanting to leave the warmth they had found. The women knew they could not keep the animals, but the memory of their shared night would stay with them forever. It was a moment of growth, of realization that even small acts of kindness could change lives, both human and animal. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Mara looked around one last time. The walls, once dark and shadowed, now seemed bright and welcoming. The fire had burned low, leaving only soft embers that glowed like tiny stars. The cabin had been a place of fear and uncertainty, but it had also become a place of learning and transformation. Mara felt a quiet pride in what they had accomplished, not something grand, but meaningful in its simplicity. Lena took one last look at the animals, whispering softly, "Be safe, find your way." Tess nodded, her eyes misty but filled with hope. The fawn and the fox watched them, then slowly disappeared into the forest, returning to the wild that was their home. The women felt a mixture of sadness and joy, knowing they had shared something extraordinary, but also that it belonged to the forest, not to them. The walk back along the snow-covered path felt different from the journey to the cabin the night before. The forest no longer seemed threatening. The wind was softer, and the trees no longer cast frightening shadows. The sunlight filtered through the branches, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed almost playful. The women walked closely together, feeling the bond they had formed through the night's events. Their steps were lighter, their spirits lifted by the experience they had shared. As they neared the edge of the forest, the distant sound of the parole officer's vehicle reached their ears. The reality of returning to the outside world began to settle in, but it did not diminish the lessons of the night. Mara, Lena, and Tess knew that they had faced fear, uncertainty, and the unknown, and had emerged stronger, more compassionate, and more connected to each other. The experience had changed them, leaving a quiet mark that would remain long after the memory of the snow and the cabin faded. When they finally reached the vehicle, they paused to look back at the forest. The cabin was small, almost hidden among the trees, but its presence now held a story of courage and kindness. Mara, Lena, and Tess exchanged a quiet glance, understanding without words the significance of the night they had shared. It had been more than a simple stay in a cabin. It had been a journey of trust, empathy, and growth. The parole officer called to them, reminding them that their work program continued, but the women hardly noticed. Their minds were still with the forest, the fire, the fawn, and the fox. They had faced the unexpected together, and in doing so, they had discovered a strength and resilience they had not known they possessed. The memory of that night would remain with them, a quiet reminder that even in dark, uncertain places, light could be found, and kindness could flourish. As the vehicle drove away, the women looked out at the receding forest, the morning sunlight glinting on the snow. They felt a sense of completion, of having lived through something extraordinary. They had faced fear, uncertainty, and loneliness, yet they had emerged with hope, courage, and a newfound connection to each other and to life itself. The experience would remain a secret shared between them, a memory of a night that no one could have expected but that had changed them forever. And so, the story of the three women, the fox and the fawn, came to a close, not with drama or danger, but with quiet reflection, understanding, and the simple, powerful truth that acts of kindness, courage, and trust could transform even the darkest of nights into moments of light.